Okay. Um, Hi, everyone. We are about to start our first of the series of the year, Hacking D&I Metrics to Track in 2019. We're doing these webinars quarterly. And so each quarter, you're going to see a different topic. We started with metrics because we're kind of feeling like that's the foundation of everything. We are, to some extent, what we measure. And if we're unable to measure the right things, then we really can't be sure that we are being effective. And I know that sometimes that's the major frustration with all of us, is that we're working so hard, and most of us really believe in this agenda in terms of inclusion as being so related to business performance and leadership performance. And yet, if we are not able to demonstrate that we are really making a difference, then we're unable to galvanize the resources and demonstrate to senior leadership that what we're doing is actually making a huge difference. So my name, as you know, Denise Parati-Hummel. I am the CEO of Leading Inclusively. And I started my journey as an attorney, as many of you know. I tried and won the first class action under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Many of you know that I became highly disillusioned with the law as a vehicle to effectuate change when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I pivoted to international mergers and acquisitions in the hope that I would at least sort of fulfill my education across cultures. And that is exactly what happened. I was at negotiation tables around the world, and I developed a methodology for more effective communications across cultures. And I grew that consulting firm to 65 countries and sold it to Ernst & Young. We have some Ernst & Young colleagues on the phone. Thank you for attending. And then I led culture, inclusion, and innovation for EY until my earnout. And then it was my decision to leave and to be able to focus full time on the connection between inclusion and business performance. So you'll see that Dr. Marshall Goldsmith, who is the #1 executive coach in the country, named me as an MG 100, which was such an honor. And it was even a bigger honor that he endorsed me as the world's leader in diversity and inclusion. All of us on the line, we know that we are all world leaders. If you're on the phone here, it means that you're terribly interested in this subject and trying to improve your game every single day. We're all world leaders. But what I liked was that he really got what we're trying to do. And that is, we are sick of resting on best practices instead of embracing next practices and utilizing the full breadth of technology and everything else that's available to us to not settle for anything, any sort of culture transformation or learning that is not sustainable. So that's a big part of our journey. It's a theme that you're going to see through everything that we do. Whenever you log into these calls, you're going to see that sort of relentless adherence to leveraging everything from what we've learned in terms of our relatively bold hypotheses to using AI and machine learning. But so let me create a foundation, if you don't mind, and then we're going to move on to metrics and why we're saying that the former way of handling metrics in terms of what we're calling vanity metrics, as opposed to metrics that can really move the needle on business performance, is not the way to go. And let's move on to the next practices that we now know work. So we're calling ourselves now, we're basically rebranding as a technology-enabled consulting firm, leveraging diversity and inclusion to improve talent strategies, culture, and performance. And again, what that means is we're going to use every means available to us in this day and age to make sure that the work that we do is moving as quickly as it can, is moving the baseline on the issues that are important to us, and that that what we're doing becomes sustainable. So thank you for being on this journey with us. A little bit of background. It's really important that you know how we approach this, so that it will make a difference in terms of when I get into metrics in some specificity, because of course we come to the table with the context of what we believe and what our methodology is. And that methodology is focus on the core, focus on the 3 areas that we know make a difference, that we know that our organizations are struggling and that we know will move the needle on business performance. And those are talent, culture, organizational culture, and risk. And I'll get into this in more detail in a minute. Next, let's have strategic initiatives, not a scattergun approach where you have an ERG here and an event here, but taking a systematic and business strategic approach the way we do to everything else in life. You wouldn't build a product, you wouldn't build an operational procedure without actually assessing first, applying any sort of learning or education to that, and then lastly, applying in a way that is actionable and sustainable. So that's how we want you to approach D&I, the same way you would in any business unit doing anything. The third is measure what matters, and we'll be talking about that from an organizational perspective as well as from a leadership perspective. But in terms of leadership, which is a huge focus of ours, because obviously the trickle down and the message from the top is critical to the success in this area, we're talking about what we call the 3 R's, which are receptive, reflective, and revitalizing, which I realize now sounds just like gobbledygook because I'm not telling you specifically what those are, but trust me, we will get into that in more detail. So taking focus, for example, that was the FSM methodology starts with focus. The reason why we say talent, culture, and risk as the 3 areas is, in talent, what are we trying to do? We are trying to recruit, retain, and advance and key diverse talent. And we're also trying to keep that talent engaged so that we don't get the problems that we get in terms of anything from productivity to losing them, basically. In terms of culture, we are absolutely convinced that if the inclusion agenda is handled correctly, that we will get a lift in innovation. And you'll see that everything we do is very much focused on the connection between inclusion and innovation. We know that we have to focus on leadership, that if we don't focus on leadership, and if our leaders are not walking the talk, that almost nothing that we do from a transformation point of view is going to work out. And we know that most of our cultures have to either transform to an inclusion culture, or at a minimum, if they're on that journey, they have to accelerate that journey in order to be competitive in this world, and they have to sustain that journey. So that's culture. And risk, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with complaints. We're dealing with impacts to our brand reputation. We're dealing with attrition. And you'll note, of course, that many of these areas overlap. But it does help us to focus if we look at something like this and say, okay, are we focused on the right things? In terms of the assess, educate, apply, which is the strategic part of this, you never fix what you don't know is problematic. You're looking for the gaps in leadership, in organizational culture, the difference between, for example, the values that the organization espouses and what is actually happening internally. You're looking to find out if your leaders are doing what they need to do. Once you have elevated that awareness, you're looking to educate the entire organization, starting with leaders when possible, to learn about these key behaviors that we spoke about, the 3 R's, and to be able to utilize those as well, which is where apply comes in. You know, you have all of this learning that people are getting. It's often, a one and done situation, and nothing is being done to sustain that learning. And so, first of all, everything we do is e-learning so that it can be scaled to the entire organization, but also there has to be a method to sustain that. Our way of doing that, you're going to see, is actually we're in development on an inclusion behavior change app that is giving our clients, the leaders in our clients' organization, drip messaging, so nudge messaging, basically in real time with micro learning that follows them around wherever they go and becomes a virtual coach to the learning that they've experienced. So we're very much moving to an integrative approach. I can share that with you in more detail later in the presentation. And last but not least, you're going to hear about the 3 R's in a little while. Right now, what I need you to know is that we have identified the key intersection between inclusion behaviors and innovation behaviors. Why? Because again, our best practices, which was to focus on inclusion behaviors, has not worked. Do you know what we've gotten? We have succeeded in some cases in growing nice leaders, but we're actually looking for nice leaders who can also stimulate growth. So we want them to be kind in their interactions, inclusive in their interactions, able to give significant engagement, but we also want them to know what innovation behaviors look like. What is it that it takes to not just reinforce diverse ideation, but also take it to the next level in terms of all members of the team, but especially diverse candidates, to give them a voice so that they will keep coming back for more and stay invested in the organization rather than just getting a paycheck. So I know that's a mouthful. We're going to stop now. You can chat if you like, but also Elizabeth is going to activate a poll, and I'd like you to take a look at it. Elizabeth, you can, if you have anything else to say, you can unmute yourself in case I'm not giving great instructions. But basically, you're going to see this poll launched, and just, it's my understanding, and Elizabeth will correct me if I'm wrong, that you can choose one or more or all of the options. And then Elizabeth will close the poll and she will report back to me, basically the results, or I will see the results. Let's see, let me open my screen and make sure. Yeah, I think I will. And if not, Elizabeth, I'll reach out to you for assistance. But just let me know when the poll is closed. Or if you need me to close the poll, I can do that too.
Sure, right now we're at 70% of attendees have voted, and so we're going to wait for just a few more seconds, and I'll close the poll and we'll be able to see the responses.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. By the way, I didn't introduce Elizabeth. Elizabeth Lane is our VP of Client Services. She's also a thought leader. You may have seen her on our vlogs about difficult conversations. She delivers some of our workshops, and she develops some of our intellectual property, so we're very proud to have her. And we have Aditya Chinnareddy on the line, who is our VP of Technology. Matt's on the line. He leads marketing, and Chelsea Semiclose is on, and she is our program manager for most of our big projects. So welcome to my entire staff. And Elizabeth, are we ready to close?
All right, we've closed the poll, and the results are 95% of our attendees agree that employee inclusion is important to company performance. 55 agree that their company regularly supports inclusion initiatives, and 23% agree that their companies successfully make these included. So we have definitely got information on this call to share that can help with those initiatives and to make employees feel included in that way.
And have you shared, did you share that with the attendees visually?
Yes, everyone can see that right now on their screen.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. For some reason, I guess as the presenter, I can't see that, but thank you for filling me in, and you can put yourself on mute, and I will just forge ahead. You may be wondering why we why we asked you these specific questions, or maybe it's obvious. But the point is, you are likely on this call because you truly believe in this mission. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have the support, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that your organization is where you want it to be. And so, having that awareness, of course, is the first step. So, thank you for sharing that with us. Your polls, by the way, are anonymous. In other words, where we show you what's in aggregate, so you can feel safe in terms of confidentiality. All right, let's get into our intro to metrics. As you know, and let me collapse this so that I can see a little bit better. Perfect. We have to agree on terms, right? We tend to, unless you're a statistician, you may be using all these terms interchangeably, which is not a tragedy, except when you're really trying to talk to senior leadership, you have to be honed in on these definitions. So data is simply facts that are gathered for measurement or analysis. You'll see them as numbers or percentages typically. Metrics are counted and tracked data, and analytics are the way that data is examined in order to report on it and to draw these conclusions that can lead to hypotheses for better results. So if we're on the same page with those, and if it helps you articulate things, then here it is. Now, why do we measure anyway? Apart from the obvious thing that you can't really demonstrate the power of your initiatives, you're looking to establish areas of weakness and strength. So you want to know where you're doing things well and improve on those or continue those particular activities. But you also want to know where you are not strong so that you can focus on moving those areas as well. It also proves the value of your intervention. So when you're going to create a business case, you're going to senior leadership to get the budget you need, you're trying to get leaders excited about sponsoring programs, you have something to hand them and to say, look, this is how I know this was valuable. And you want long-term strategic success. The last thing we need as D&I professionals is to be looked at as non-strategic or necessary overhead or people who all they do is administer to complaints. We want to be seen as strategic leaders who are directly aligned with the business agenda of the organization. We want to provide executive visibility into the overall organizational health of the organization and to be part of that journey. When we measure something, we can demonstrate improvement. Now, in terms of the organizational metrics and in these three focus areas, we want to know whether we are failing to recruit, retain, and advance key diverse talent. We want to know if we are having lower engagement of particular groups of people. And of course, the most easily identified are women. Sometimes race is identifiable. There are lots of hidden diversity, as you all know, that we can't actually pinpoint necessarily, except maybe through observation techniques. In terms of culture, we want to know, are we limiting diverse ideation? Or do we have a lack of inclusive behaviors in leadership? Are we in some way, do we have barriers for the transformation that we have articulated is important to us? In terms of risk, we're looking to find out whether we can reduce employee complaints or lawsuits, whether we can reduce attrition, and whether we can avoid any sort of impact on the brand reputation of our organization and our leaders. Now, here's where it starts to get interesting, because we typically are tracking diversity numbers, and we are typically tracking those at the beginning. So in other words, when they're hired, some organizations are actually able to track the advancement through the talent pipeline at some critical moments, and through what we call the sticky middle, and some are measuring at the top as well. What we're all seeing, all of us, everywhere, with very few exceptions, are this large talent pool at the beginning. Often, some of us are lucky enough that we're almost 50-50 at the bottom. And what we see is that diminishes over time to the sticky middle until we're left with 6% in the C-suite. Some of us, of course, have no women or people of color in the C-suite at all. But here is the important thing. Those metrics are certainly helpful, but they do not indicate where we are losing people in the pipeline, nor does it indicate initiatives that we should be focusing on. And so when we talk about metrics that matter from an organizational point of view, we are looking for your organizations to be starting from the very beginning of the talent pipeline all the way through the end and beyond. So starting with recruiting, are you focused on getting a diverse slate of candidates? Why? Because if you don't have women and people of color being interviewed, of course, how in the world can you hire them, let alone advance them through the talent pipeline? In terms of interviewing, do you have a diverse slate of interviewers? Are your interviewers educated as to what unconscious bias looks like and how to transform to inclusive behaviors when you're in an interview setting? In terms of onboarding, are we creating a soft landing for all of our employees and certainly for our diverse candidates? Are we checking in with them periodically to see how they're doing, what we can do to make their lives easier and to help them succeed? In terms of people management, are we doing what we need to do to develop the kind of culture on our teams and organizations that will really make a difference? In performance evaluation, are we evaluating people according to their real accomplishments or even their stretch assignments in order to give them leadership opportunities? Do we have succession plans? And if we do, are those succession plans filled with all types of people instead of just one kind of person, so that we can use gender and race and other diversity as a bona fide criteria for balancing our organizations? And last, and this is very scary for a lot of people, are we conducting exit interviews at or after the time of attrition to ask the bold questions that we need to ask so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again related to losing key diverse talent? So this is critical here, because these are the points of interface where we can actually make a difference. We can develop initiatives that impact every one of these things and therefore shores up the talent pipeline. Talking about how, oh, the talent pipeline is leaking and the sticky middle and using all those phrases without looking boldly at all these different phases and asking what we can do is problematic. It makes us ineffective. All right, now let's take that deeper dive that I promised you into the 3 R's. When it comes to our leadership and our organization as a whole, are we really measuring what matters in terms of leadership behaviors? So few institutions measure with KPIs or actual performance goals related to inclusion, number one. Number two, if they do, again, I alluded to before that if it's just inclusion behaviors without those innovation behaviors combined, you're not going to get the lift you're looking at. And I'll even give you a sneak preview at the end of some of the questions that are on our particular survey in order to give you an idea of what the difference is between inclusion behaviors and innovation and what is the nexus between the two. But for the most part, we're looking for these 3 R's. We're looking to know if our leaders and our teams, individual contributors as well, are receptive, not only accepting of others' differences, but also curious to understand them better. So it's more of an act than it is a passive behavior. For reflective, are we aware of our own biases, number one, and therefore potentially able to interrupt them through thoughtful contemplation? And are we transparent about our decision making? Do we make decisions based on facts rather than who we feel that we have an affinity towards? And revitalizing, it sounds like, I mean, you know, sort of like a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi sort of, you know, bigger than life personality. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about those who inspire inclusion in others through their own behaviors and empower team members to be the very best that they can be. So keep that in mind as we move on. There'll be more and more detail on this as we go on. What are some of the common mistakes that we make in terms of D&I metrics? I've already spoken about some of them, right? Let's see to some extent if this is a recap or of something you already know, or are we moving you to the next level? So the very first thing is we are not setting specific goals. Some of our organizations have in the back of our minds, some of our top leaders have in the back of our minds, oh, goals means affirmative action, and goals means that we're trying to reach a certain quota. That is not what I'm talking about. I am talking about setting goals where you are looking to increase the percentage of certain people at certain levels, for example, by using diversity and diverse teams as a bona fide criteria in addition to the actual technical criteria of the job, not instead of. And that's the pushback you have to give when people talk about, oh no, we're not going to set any goals. Next is the tracking or sharing of only vanity metrics. You might have noticed that I used that expression before. And what I mean by that is if we're only tracking how many diverse candidates we have, diverse talent we have at the bottom level, and perhaps we even know that we're losing them, but we're not tracking where and cultivating our initiatives around those, then that's nothing more than vanity metrics. It's not going to make a difference at all. If we're not using the data that we see to address where the pipeline is leaking, how in the world can we intervene? And if we're not holding our leaders accountable for their behavior, that's the last really, really big problem. I realize that most organizations do not have goals, performance goals or KPIs around their leaders' ability to lead inclusive teams. There are so many techniques associated with that we can explore. For us, we actually are using the engagement with the Inclusion Behavior Change app in order to count towards a KPI or a performance goal associated with inclusion. But there are other methods as well, including 360s and other measures for holding leaders accountable for their behavior. So I'm going to stop here to give you an opportunity to ask questions. If you've been entering your questions in the chat bar all the way along, which I encourage you to do because sometimes you just forget your questions, this will be the time for Elizabeth to read questions to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. If I say to you, we're about to talk about that, it's not to dissuade you from asking questions. It's just that I really am going to talk about it in the next section of the presentation. So just keep that in mind. But Elizabeth, I will wait for you to unmute and to give me any questions that are coming in. They might be trickling in now. So we'll definitely give people a chance to type. And then you can let me know. We'll take a maximum of 3 questions right now, but please keep in mind, and there's our corporate.
We do have several questions.
Okay.
We do have several questions coming in. The first one is, can you expand on next practices, a term you used when talking about best practices versus next practices? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So here's the situation. We know that our best practices, our historic practices, have not worked, and we know that we have to be bold in our hypotheses and not be afraid of what we can do in the future to make that better. I'm going to give you a perfect example. We thought that unconscious bias training, awareness training, would give us the lift in performance as well as the ability to recruit, retain, and advance diverse talent. It has not. It has not. And in some cases has even backfired. And so we had to take the bold hypothesis that the reason for that is that we were raising awareness without substituting that with what are inclusive behaviors and what do they look like in the workplace, and giving people the opportunity to apply those and to sustain those. So from our point of view, we tested that hypothesis. We changed our unconscious bias training to a program called From Unconscious Bias to Inclusive Behaviors. We also did a complete digital transformation so that the entire organization could get that, so e-learning, and we were right. So we started to get the lift that we were looking for. We started to be able to prove out that we were able to recruit, retain, and advance diverse talent more effectively. We have statistics on our website under resources. You'll see case studies. You know, we were right that to move beyond the sticky middle, we had to invent something that would sustain those behaviors, which is how the Inclusion Behavior Change app was born. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody should go out and you know, create an app, but I am suggesting that when we know from a common sense point of view that what we're doing isn't working, that we make bold hypotheses and then we test them. That's really what I mean by next practices. Thank you for asking.
All right, we have another question here. There are companies being more transparent with their data in their annual reporting, and how effective is that practice in creating accountability for leaders and organizations?
Yeah, I mean, you know, transparency of data on some level, especially if it is accompanied by action to address the transparency, let's say if the numbers are not great, at a minimum on an internal level is so significant, because it shows that your organization actually cares, that it's hearing the voice. I mean, what is the point of putting out an employee engagement survey or an inclusion survey or our 3Rs survey or anything associated with that if you don't actually report the data transparently, at least internally, and then do something about it? I think it's very difficult sometimes, especially if the data really reflects poorly, to be open about that. But you've seen some great transformation from companies who have actually said, you know, that let's say they've addressed certain very difficult things. They've had a high visibility leader who's been reported, or they have organization, you know, they're being called out, particularly in tech and life sciences, where, you know, they're being called out publicly, but then they rise to the occasion. They put the actual resources behind effective initiatives, and then they're bold about presenting that openly. I don't know how many of you have seen the Gillette commercial, or some of the Nike commercials, or even some of the Microsoft commercials that have come out recently. I mean, to me, that's an acknowledgement things are not working, and guess what? We're going to make them work. So transparency of data on some level is absolutely critical. Thank you.
All right, and there are several questions that we are going to address later in the presentation. So we'll go ahead and move on. And just know that if your question has not been answered at this point, it is likely to be answered in the next portion of the presentation. So I'm holding on to it until then.
Wonderful. And again, if for any reason we don't get to it because of timing or what have you, just feel free to reach out at this email address. One member of the staff will certainly be able to help you. That's the goal. The goal is for no one to go away feeling like they didn't get an answer to their question. So thank you, Elizabeth. All right, let's get into metrics to track. We've talked about organizational metrics and leadership metrics. I think, you know, starting with organizational metrics in that TCR, the talent culture risk. We're just trying to give you some sort of an idea of what to measure. So in talent, you're looking to actually measure diverse candidates who do not accept an offer, for example, by level. Or I'll give you another example, percentage of diverse candidates who are offered an interview but don't take the interview, don't accept the offer, leave within, well, leave is really more the attrition part of that, but going down to risk, the percentage of attrition of diverse employees and when they're leaving. In terms of organizational culture, how many, what's the percentage at least of leaders? I keep talking about leaders. Just keep in mind, for example, for our e-learning, we have a leadership track and we have an individual contributor track. The reason why we're so focused on leaders, obviously, is if there's limited budget, we want to at least expose the leaders to what inclusive behaviors look like. So if you hear me keep talking about leaders, that's why. But how many of them are completing at least on an annual basis? I mean, we all know, again, that one and done thing just doesn't work. So you're hoping for more opportunities for learning, reflection, the micro learning, for example, that is such an integral part of our app, so that that learning keeps going, but at a minimum that they're at least revisiting inclusive leadership education on an annual basis. And we've already talked about the 3 R's, so I won't belabor it, but is there a method that we have used to actually track that? We use the term KPI, key performance indicator, associated with performance, but some people just use performance goals, for example, so don't let that acronym throw you off. But do we have a method to measure that? So do we have a 360? Do we have engagement with an app or engagement with other sort of micro-learning? Do we have are we looking to see what team members think of the inclusive behaviors of the leader? Let's face it, people are busy and we are overwhelmed. We have kids, we have other responsibilities. We're trying to get to the gym. We're trying to meet our sales targets and whatever other hard, performance goals that we have. And so if we're not going to be measured, if our bonus is not going to be dependent on that, if our ability to advance or our salary isn't going to be dependent on that, then what is really the point? Then it's just a nice to have. And we're not looking for a nice, we're looking for a nice plus. We're looking for a nice plus business growth and team growth. So I hope I'm not beating a dead horse on that, but just wanted to share that with you. Now, back to setting goals. I know that you guys have, you women and men have heard the expression, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. By the way, I don't know if you can tell, but this is a female team here, not a male team. I did that on purpose. But, it is, I get it, that it's scary. It's like setting a sales target. That's scary too, but that doesn't prevent sales from setting the target, right? We set targets as human beings on purpose because it's something to strive for. When we don't, and when we're not afraid to, and I don't even want to use the term fail. It's not a failure if you don't reach. It's you're getting closer every time, every year. And if you're not getting closer, you're figuring out why, and you're not afraid, again, to make those bold hypotheses. So on your screen are some of the very basic examples. We can take questions about this if this doesn't seem intuitive to you, but you're basically trying to recruit, retain, and advance key diverse talent. And to some extent, it has to be, when we use the term diversity, of course, there's cognitive diversity, there's personality diversity, introverts and extroverts, there's LGBTQ+, there's various disabilities, hidden and non-hidden, but it's so hard to track those with other than, say, empirical evidence, because it's not as easy to identify. So sometimes we have to just latch on to things like gender, color, ethnicity in order to be effective. In terms of the three R's, I don't want to beat a dead horse on that, but I do want you to understand what I mean by that. Because what we used to do is we used to say things like, I So it was a bold hypothesis that worked, and I don't want to imply that every hypothesis that we've had over the past 20 years has worked, right? Otherwise, we'd be relying on them now. But the point is that this precious intersection appears to be the one that's working, at least based on our clients in enterprise and our results. So for what that's worth to you. Now, in terms of actual goals or KPIs and the accountability associated with that, more examples. If the objectives that you're setting, for example, have a regular and systematic method of assessing organizational and leadership gaps, then choose a target associated with that. Could be 100%, could be 80%, but have some way of assessing organizationally and from a leadership point of view what those gaps are. You'll see the goal and target on the right. Be aware of next practices as we have spoken about. Don't, on the right again, next to that, don't rely on unconscious bias awareness training when all of the literature and statistics specifically say it doesn't work. Focus on the behaviors that you're trying to get them to understand and utilize. Find ways to make the learning sticky. I get it that not everyone is going to use our app, but there are other methods to make the learning regular and sustainable over time. Could be, in our case with the app, it's on literally on a daily basis. They say, I want to focus on performance evaluations, or I want to focus on meetings, and they'll get messaging on, have you thought about strategies to bring out the quieter voices? That's on a daily basis. At a minimum, as organizations, we can give the opportunity to sustain that learning on a quarterly basis. That would be my argument. So Elizabeth, I realize we're at a time for a poll. So if you would activate that poll, please. And if you're on the webinar, if you would mind just voting, that would be great. And then Elizabeth will report to me, at least. I guess you guys actually see the percentages, and she'll tell me the answers to these questions. So Elizabeth, would you activate the poll?
The poll is up and active, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond.
Okay, thank you. I see we have about, we're good, 15 minutes left, which is awesome.
All right, so here are the results. I'm sharing with everyone. And the results are 78% believe in setting specific D&I goals or targets, which is great.
That's wonderful.
Only 2% believe that setting specific D&I goals hurts the hiring process.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the percentage on that.
9.
Okay.
And 19% that the use of D&I goals or targets is not necessary.
Okay. Okay. All right, and that's fair. I mean, I totally get that this is a controversial issue. Trust me, I really understand that, and I respect every opinion on this call. Just hopefully for those of you who are a little resistant to that, or are in organizations that are resistant, and maybe it'll just give you some time to reflect on a different point of view. But I get it. I really get it. It's very controversial. So thank you for sharing. Okay. Elizabeth, I think I might leave questions for the end, if that's okay, or are you being inundated and you feel like we can't wait?
I do have some questions, but they're fine to hold for the end. So we'll go ahead and go through, and then.
Why don't we take one question and then move through?
Okay. All right. How about this one from one of our attendees?
Okay. Thanks.
How can you measure the number of diverse candidates that don't accept an interview or offer? How do you know what dimension of diversity they identify with?
Well, I mean, this is your tough one, right? If they don't accept an interview, it's harder, right? If they don't accept an offer, you probably know if they have some element of diversity, at least the visual ones, right? You probably know gender, you probably know race, you probably know ethnicity. It's super tough, prior to that. So, when it comes to a resume, you can often tell by the name, the first name of the person, the gender, often, not always. You can sometimes have a guess at the ethnicity. Guessing at race is even harder. So you're absolutely right. At the beginning, you're not necessarily at the beginning of the talent pipeline, meaning the actual resume stage. It's difficult, and frankly, this is another controversial area because some people want blind resumes, and there's a thought about the effectiveness of that. But once you get past the interview stage, obviously it gets easier. All right, so Elizabeth, I'll move on, and then we can do more questions at the end, as well as making ourselves available through email. And then just remember that we are doing office hours, so you'll be getting an email on that. Once a month, we will be doing 1 hour where you get to show up with your challenges and questions, and I just answer them. And if we have a small enough group of people, we can actually interact. If not, it can just be, more of a question and answer sort of environment. In terms of getting started, again, this is pretty much a recap. Focus on what matters. Be strategic in your approach and measure what really counts, okay? And you will get initiatives with impact, change that lasts, and leaders that win. Simple recap on that. In terms of being strategic, start with an assessment, move to educate your entire organization for the behaviors that actually matter, and then find some way to scale and sustain what you have created. Don't go for one-offs. They don't work, and they can backfire in terms of demonstrating your commitment and your organization's commitment to this work. If you're going to use, so we have an organizational inclusion index and you can utilize whatever sort of organizational instrument you want for assessment. The thing I like about ours, and I haven't really had a chance to talk about it, which is why I added it here, is that it deals with the critical 8 areas of business that you want to measure. So when you're evaluating, whether it's our instrument or your own, Look at the leadership and accountability issues. Look at strategy and implementation. Look at recruiting. Look at retention. Look at advancement and performance management. Evaluate your benefits, services, and other work options, including flex time. Look at your marketing and your corporate communications. I can't tell you how many examples in corporate communications alone. And again, they're busy and they're doing their best, but they're not always aware. And so you, in some cases, will need to partner with them for that improvement. And look at external stakeholders. What kinds of vendors are you using? What kinds of terms are you using associated with those vendors, particularly those who are diverse? Excuse me, one second. Okay. Sorry. Okay, I guess we had a sound issue. I'm so sorry about that. My apologies. In our case, our assessment is easy because it can be completed by a diversity and inclusion professional, by HR in conjunction with other stakeholders within the company. But the important thing is that you evaluate every area of the business. Again, this is another thing, and of course, I'm biased, right? We created this instrument on purpose in this way. Our instrument, in terms of the self-assessment, as well as the 360, is short, the one that measures the intersection between inclusion and innovation behaviors. And when you press finish, that participant gets an automatic findings and recommendations plan and an action plan in their inbox. And we live in a day and age where people want continuity and immediate response and the ability to make those results actionable. So they get an action plan. Don't use an instrument where their responses are going out into the ether and they don't get any actionable way to implement the results. I've spoken about this before, but I'll say it again, it bears repetition. Move those leaders beyond to inclusive leadership, provide them with an opportunity for asynchronous learning so that when they're at the airport or they're at their kids' soccer game waiting for them to warm up before the game or what have you, they can log in and they can get learning in bite-sized chunks that they can deal with, that doesn't become overwhelming. And by all means, please don't limit your training or focus your training on regulatory issues or sexual harassment or this and that, because yes, that deals with the preventative side, but not the opportunity side. I'm not going to get into the Inclusion Virtual Coach app right now because unless you want to engage with us on that, most organizations are not going to be able to develop their own app for sure, but you can reinforce with micro learnings. You can figure out a way to support your leaders that includes giving them information on a periodic basis, at a minimum videos and podcasts and other instruments and tools to keep that learning going. So I want to do this one last poll and then move to questions. So Elizabeth, if you'd activate the poll, and then our remaining 5 minutes or so will be entirely geared towards questions. So while you're doing the poll, I did want to say to you that those of you who are on this call, you all stayed, which is just amazing. You will be getting our business case deck so that if you have any problems getting the resources you need from leadership, they can see the actual business reason for doing that. You will be getting a link to the recording of this webinar. Share it with whomever you like. The idea, one thing that Marshall Goldsmith taught me is be generous, be generous, be generous. It will always come back to you, and it has. So we are on this journey with you, whether you're our clients or not, is the point. We're looking for real society transformation, as well as obviously being able to sustain ourselves as a business. You will be getting a link to the organizational mini assessment, an email about the office hours. We have video teasers, 4-minute video teasers for the assessment, the e-learning, and the app. We'll likely only send that to you upon request because we don't want to be salesy. And of course, Elizabeth and others on our team can give you a full demo of all of the technology that I've mentioned that we have. And then last but not least, info@leadinclusively.com will be able to answer any questions or continue the conversation. Elizabeth, do we have the poll completed?
We are still collecting answers. People are still responding. So I'm going to give it a few more seconds, and then I'll close the poll and show the results.
I mean, we're basically complete. So all we have to do is questions. So I think we'll be all right.
All right, the results are in, and the answer is a 45% and 45% both assess inclusive leadership behaviors and require leaders to take inclusive leadership training. So that's about equal. And then only 13% have a method to sustain inclusion transformation.
That doesn't surprise me. So, Elizabeth, let's make sure in webinar 2, which is coming up, let's make sure, please, that we focus on some methods to sustain. We can share, more directly information regarding the app, but give them actual tools and suggestions regarding sustainability. Okay, and was there a third one?
The results for question number 1 and question number 2 were exactly the same.
Oh, okay. Okay, awesome. All right, well, that was very informative. Let's open it up to questions. Elizabeth, you can just feed those to me. And I see we have my direct email here, which is fine. If you want to reach me directly, that is fine. I will likely connect you with Chelsea semi-close if you need to get on my calendar. Or if you need a demo, I would likely connect with Elizabeth Lane, but feel free, info@ or denise.hummel@leadinclusively.com. Okay, Elizabeth, I'm ready.
Absolutely, and I will also be reaching out to some of these questions so that we can provide more in-depth answers.
Okay, that's awesome. That's great. That's a great way to handle it. Just actively reach out. I like that.
Okay, so here's the first question. I'm seeing clearly the KPIs for diversity, but I don't understand how to measure innovation to get that 3R sweet spot shown in the Venn diagram. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I have to be completely transparent here. We are the only firm that has that instrument. It took us a year and a half to develop and test and to get the results that we got. And so unfortunately, you can only get that through us that I know of. And so, you're not going to be in a position to, hire organizational psychologists and thought leaders and this and that, but just so you know that it's so affordable. I can give you I can't give 230 people a test, but we can give you a demo so that you can see some of the questions and see what the action report looks like, and where we'd be honored to engage with you on that.
How about this one? We have been advised not to require or mandate leaders to take inclusive leadership training, rather to highly encourage them, as requiring can create an automatic barrier before the session even begins. What are your thoughts?
I'll respond to that. And, Elizabeth, just put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, because there's just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of interference. But so here's, despite what you read, and I will admit the jury's out on making it mandatory. The benefits of making it mandatory is it demonstrates a commitment from the top. Certainly anything that's mandatory, you know how humans are. It doesn't matter if, you're trying to get your kids to take the socks off the floor and you make it mandatory or they'll lose their allowance, all the way up to trying to force someone to take training on safety related to regulatory compliance. There is going to be resistance if you're human and you're being told you have to do something. My position, and it's one that I stick by, is that if you can make it mandatory in a way that demonstrates that you have a commitment to your organizational values, which I can almost guarantee are somewhat related to inclusion in terms of integrity and respect and the things that typically organizations have as values or leadership standards, that you demonstrate that you're standing behind that. But again, this is an organizational decision, and I totally respect, the decision. Some is better than nothing, let's face it. So if you know your organizational culture and you think that's going to backfire, trust that instinct, and you might be right. And I see that we're a little bit over. So Elizabeth, I love your idea about reaching out individually and confidentially to anyone whose question has not been answered. I love that we had this time together, and I am really, Elizabeth, what is the title of the next webinar? Do we have that already scheduled?
We do. It's From Unconscious Bias to Inclusive Behaviors in conjunction with Watermark on June 26th. And we will be sending out the details on that, so everyone can keep their eyes peeled for the invitation.
Okay. Okay, that's wonderful. And let's be sure to include sustainability in that, because I think that was an absolutely critical question. Thank you, everybody. Again, it was an honor to be with you. Let's keep in touch. Reach out on LinkedIn, please. Let's be able to be connected. All right. Thank you to my staff, and thanks to everybody on the call.